This is Locked On Sports Atlanta, and it's time for the Atlanta Football Party, only on Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Atlanta Football Party, your home for the best Atlanta Falcons football talk. It's local insight you can't get anywhere but right here at Locked On. I'm your host, Tenitra Batiste. Alongside me, our Falcons analyst, Jarvis Davis, Locked On Falcons host, Aaron Freeman, and senior Falcons reporter, Tori McElhaney. The Atlanta Football Party is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Zac Robinson might be heavy on leg strength. We'll discuss, and big energy for the Falcons offense from the original 7. We'll download on that. And is he your X factor too? We'll talk about it. But first, does a move Friday mean we can finally move on? Well, we'll see. So the Aaron Rodgers to the Steelers saga finally ended with Rodgers signing a 1-year deal and making it official Saturday morning. But Tori, are we finally ready to move on with Kirk Cousins as QB2 for the Falcons? Unless and until, of course, we know a QB1 position opens up due to a starter going down, then that restarts the clock. But really, did the clock start, restart, just kind of give us a breather after the Steelers Rodgers saga kind of closed out?
I think that it kind of was a bit like a nice little bow in it for right now.
Yeah.
I think that if there's a Kirk Cousins package, we put the bow on it with the Aaron Rodgers decision, because I think that was the first domino that needed to fall. Once you go through the draft and you see all of the different decisions that were made across the quarterback market in that regard, Aaron Rodgers and his kind of holdout and decision was ultimately going to mean the most for a team like the Steelers going after or needing Kirk Cousins. Now that Aaron Rodgers is in Pittsburgh, I kind of am just like, all right, we're exactly where we have said we were going to be since January. And I don't necessarily see anything changing between now and the start of training camp. I think that this, again, I go back to something I said back in February, like we're going to be talking about Kirk Cousins, honestly, through training camp, probably through the preseason. I am really, with mandatory minicamp starting literally tomorrow, and you have 2 days of practices, this is going to be a really, really big week in terms of the quarterback conversation around Kirk Cousins. Does he show up to mandatory minicamp? Do we see him practicing? Is he taking reps behind Michael Penix? And if he's not, what does that mean moving forward for this organization as well? There are a lot of questions about Kirk Cousins that I think we will be able to answer as this week unfolds, but I don't necessarily think that changes Kirk being on the roster or not into training camp. I think that is kind of where we are, unless something catastrophic happens to a quarterback room in another place and they literally have this like desperation moment. I don't see any movement happening at all from now to camp. And then if he doesn't show up to mini camp this week, does he show up to training camp in July and August? Like, what does that mean for potentially like a preseason? It's honestly, I think the Falcons have kind of like, they've laid their cards down and they've kind of given, I think, Kirk the hey, we told you this is what's going to happen. If there's a plan out there that makes sense, if there's something out there that makes sense, we'll do it. But until then, you're on this roster and you're going to continue as the backup. It's kind of up to you what that looks like. So this week is a big week in the Kirk Cousins conversation. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, like you said, we kind of put a curtain call or a closed curtain on Act 1 of the Kirk Cousins saga, but we know that there's a part 2 coming because, Jarvis, there were eyes rather on Flowery Branch to see, will Kirk Cousins show up? Will he be in the building? Will he be nearby for voluntary OTAs? But now we are getting to the mandatory spaces within the offseason activities, right? And so I think that will reset the conversation. And I'll come back to what Tori was talking about as well, as far as where the Falcons are, how we got here and whether or not there was an overplay of the hand. But first things first, Jarvis, now that Rodgers and Steelers are best buds, what does that mean for us as far as, is it truly the curtain is closed, at least for now, until ...
First of all, this has been a plan all along. As soon as they said, we're going to roll this $10 million into 2026, we're going to take that on, and this guy's going to be our QB2 going forward until we get our socks knocked off for a particular deal. They haven't had their socks knocked off, so, hey, this is where we are. And I think that, only thing they have to really worry about is potentially uncomfortable answering uncomfortable questions. Right? If he doesn't show up, like Tori talked about, yeah, it's gonna be a little weird. It's gonna be a little awkward. But Raheem Morris might cringe just a little bit or be annoyed about these questions when it comes to Kirk Cousins and his backup quarterback. So, but other than that, like this is par for the course. Like they've been prepared for this. They've been locked in on this, no pun intended or pun intended. I'm a company man every now and then. But this is what we're gonna have to get used to. And I know Aaron is just chomping at the bit to talk about Kirk Cousins, being the backup quarterback for this team. So, this is where we are, and I'm not surprised by it at all. People who are surprised by it, upset by it, like the Falcons have been saying this in your face since January, like Tori mentioned. So yeah, this is something we have to get used to until something catastrophic happens for another team, and they say, "Hey, big head, we need a quarterback."
Aaron, for you, is that the same too? Like, not so much that we have completely done as dreads for nothing. I'm sorry, I got to make this sidebar comment. Said, please God deliver me from Kirk Cousins discourse.
I'm sorry, we can't. We
Sorry.
can't. It's out of my hands.
It's Tori. It's more of our pay grade, right? On so many levels. We understand dreads. Aaron, we would love to not have this conversation, not continue this discourse. But real talk, it's probably just on a pause right now, right? Thanks to Aaron Rodgers and the Pittsburgh Steelers finally deciding that they want to be BFFs. But ultimately speaking, we did get a little bit of a pause. Yeah, kind of.
Well, I mean, it depends, right? Like in terms of Kirk going to another team, yeah, I think that conversation is pretty much done at this point in time. The writing has been on the wall as far as that goes for probably 2+ months at this point in time. It was just kind of inevitable that Aaron Rodgers was going to sign with the Steelers. The lack of urgency on both parts, where it's like, this is suspiciously lackadaisical, I guess you could say, in terms of these teams getting together at some point. There, we know in the NFL that when teams don't have an answer at quarterback, they tend to get very desperate, and the Steelers have not been very desperate at that position all off season long. So that kind of told you where things were kind of headed in that regard. But yeah, like Kirk going to another team, yeah, that's probably done. Again, there will be conversations if there are injuries and all the things that Jarvis and Tori have talked about, although those things are relatively rare. So it's unlikely that we're going to be having those conversations, but it's still a possibility. And now the discourse on Kirk Cousins just is like, is he going to show up? He showed up for some of the voluntary workouts. Is he going to show up for mandatory workouts, as Tori talked about this week? Then we get the training camp. Is he going to show up? Is he going to take practice reps, and how many practice reps? Is he going to play in the pre? Like, it's just all the sort of standard backup quarterback stuff, but because it's Kirk Cousins and because of all the money that the Falcons paid him and, the Michael Penix of it all and all that stuff, it becomes a ongoing conversation that we have to talk about the backup quarterback a ton. Last year it made sense because Michael Penix was seen as the future. This year it still makes sense because it's just the way how these things go. But at the same time, it's like, well, Kirk Cousins is the past. And so therefore it's like, why are we talking about this? I understand the sentiment, but it is what it is, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it is. But as I was getting the show ready, Tori, I don't know, my mind just kind of went back to the fact that, yeah, we have been having this conversation for well longer than any of us wanted to. But I also feel like that's part and parcel to the fact that the Falcons were standing on business, and Kirk Cousins and his agent McCartney tried to stand on business. But I feel like at this point, when you look at how, like, kind of the whole closeout of Rodgers Steelers, right, that made me think back to, well, I feel like they overplayed their hand. So one of the reasons that Kirk Cousins was relegated to QB2, and we're still having this conversation in the first place and still waiting for a domino that is not Falcons driven. The reason we're waiting for that domino is because I think they overplayed their hand. And here we are. You're QB2 until the Falcons say otherwise.
Yeah, I think that for a long time there were very early on, it was a bit like, oh, well, Kirk Cousins holds all the cards, and Kirk Cousins in his camp holds all the cards. And I think that once you got to that $10 million payout,
There it is.
once the free agency hit, it was like, actually, no, the Falcons have all the cards. And when you think about ultimately, like, yeah, Kirk Cousins has his no trade clause. So yeah, but if he wants to go play, he's going to waive that. So it was just a matter of like, can the Falcons get something for Kirk Cousins? That's been the conversation for a long time. I think that the part of it that I still am a bit wary about is the fact that leading up to the Super Bowl, he does disclose that he has this injury that, for lack of a better word, like, he was on the injury report and he played 3 more games after that. Like, and he was asked over and over and over again, multiple times throughout the end of the season. Once the decision was made, Raheem Morris was asked, Michael Penix was asked, Kirk Cousins himself was asked, is this anything due to an injury? And he said, point blank period, no. And I think that is also something that once Kirk Cousins has the chance or is willing to go on the record, I think that needs to be cleared up a bit about this shoulder, elbow injury that he claimed after the season was a problem, but during the season didn't say anything about it. So I think like there are some things that need to be cleaned up a little bit based on all of that. And I do think that that needs to happen sooner rather than later. That's kind of why I personally, as a journalist covering this team, I do hope that he is at mandatory minicamp. And even if he doesn't practice, he at least speaks to the media and sets some things straight, because I do think that would go a long way. I mean, I'm not making any decisions at all, but I do think that would go a long way with teams across the league if he could speak to what he wants, what he needs, and where he is in his career and how much he wants to be maybe somewhere else.
Yeah, because I've often wondered about that too, Jarvis. I feel like that's just one of those things that is an outlier of what really happened. Like what really transpired, especially as we kind of saw that downward spiral in terms of Kirk Cousins on the field, if you will. I think that's something that, again, it may not be the number one thing that's the determining factor because we know some quarterback is going to go down. We're not here wishing ill will on anyone, but we've seen it the last couple of seasons where a team that maybe is in contention or would have been in contention is all of a sudden in jeopardy because, oh my goodness, the quarterback went down, QB1 went down, now what? But there's still that little caveat. There's still that little cloud that's kind of hovering over Kirk Cousins. And I think too, that could be a little bit of an overplay of the hand as well, because there was a question of, okay, why now? Why then? Why is all this information coming out? It's the posturing, so on and so forth. But I still feel like here we are, beginning of June, and all of those things, and the Falcons are still in the driver's seat.
I mean, I look at it from this standpoint. Yeah, true. I definitely agree with you that the Falcons are in the driver's seat, but I feel like Kirk is telling the truth. It explains a lot of things because he made some dumb decisions on the field as far as with taking care of the football, right? Like that 4 interception game against the Chargers, I was ready. I was like, man, what we doing? He ain't got it no more. He 37 years old, coming off an Achilles injury. Like, this is the type of stuff that happens. We used to seeing stuff like this with these older quarterbacks that have that big time injury later on in their career. So yeah, I wasn't surprised by that at all. So when he came out and said that, I still was hurt, I was like, okay, all this told me was that like his biggest fear, came true because he knew that if he would have come out and said, yeah, man, I ain't 100%, and the Falcons were like, oh, okay, Kirk, yeah, man, go ahead, get healthy. Meanwhile, let's bring on this new toy that we have in here. And we all know that that's not what Kirk Cousins wanted to deal with. That's why Minnesota Vikings let him go, because they were very upfront. They were like, hey, man, we want to bring in a young quarterback, groom situation, usher in, all that stuff. Kirk was like, nah, I'm cool on that. So that's why they end up cutting him. So, and I think that he found himself in that situation again. Like, okay, if I disclose this injury, or if I say, hey guys, I can't do it, I can't play to the best of my ability, because we knew he could play because he was out there, right? But he knew that he wasn't going to be the quarterback that he was on that Thursday night game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers when everybody was just like, yep, going to the Super Bowl, baby, it's about to go down. But, he would just I think it was an internal struggle for him to kind of keep that under wraps because he knew what the end result was. And the end result was going to be 9 stepping on that field, and he wasn't going to come off, especially what he played in the last 3 games of the season.
It does make a lot of sense because I can remember, Aaron, even on post-game shows on Sundays, I can remember Torrey being in the media box, in the press box, and people just, head scratchers. Or sometimes Jarvis, us just texting back and forth, just head scratchers of what is going on. And the only thing, because of the way things played out as far as like the injury report and him continuing to get on the field and start every game, only thing you could think of was maybe there was that one game that was bad, but sometimes you can't flush it. And so maybe it's mental with him. And so that's where I think we all kind of landed like, what the heck? Like, Free, that mentally he's tapped out. But I do think that obviously it probably was a little more physical than it was mental, than maybe we'd all even understood or assessed at the time. But I do think the way that it played out and how Kirk brought that out and how he and his team decided to address it postseason, I still think it ended up playing in the favor of the Falcons.
Yeah, I think you can spin it that way. We talked about it a lot at the end of the last season that Kirk was pressing, and we were wondering why Kirk was pressing. Was he feeling the heat from Michael Penix? Was it the lack of performance? And obviously, the injury probably plays a big part of that. I guess for me, it's hard for me to say that the Falcons are winning this situation just because they spent a lot of resources on Kirk Cousins, and it's kind of prevented them from spending some of those resources to improve the rest of their roster. And sure, if winning this situation is the Falcons hold all the cards to moving on from Kirk Cousins as opposed to what Kirk Cousins wants, and him winning this situation is being able to start for another team, then sure, I guess if we're playing that sort of zero-sum sort of game, then the Falcons are winning in that regard. But at the same time, Kirk is still going to get paid a lot of money. He's got a no-trade clause. He's pretty much has probably the cushyish backup quarterback job in the world as far as the money he's making, $27.5 million this year. He's the first $40 million backup in NFL history. So it's hard for me to sit here and say like, oh, the Falcons are winning this situation. But they hold Kirk's rights. And so, his future, they, as others have said, kind of determine his future. And from that standpoint, they do hold the leverage, but it is hard for me to sit here and say like, oh, they're winning this situation when they're spending so much resources on a backup quarterback.
Yeah. And I think maybe winning is probably not the right verbiage for that. I think maybe winning as far as leverage is concerned, because at this point, I feel like maybe the Falcons aren't winning the situation, but they're leveraging, the leverage is in their court. Like, I do think that they still have the advantage in terms of how this situation is going to play out relative to like you guys mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the conversation, at the beginning of this whole controversy, everything was, oh God, Kirk's no trade clause. Like that seemed to be the linchpin. But as time kind of wore on, it just seemed like standing firm on him being QB2 ended up being a bit of a leverage piece for the Falcons that maybe nobody really believed in the beginning, because we thought no way in the world, to your point, Free, that there would be a $40 million backup quarterback. But the Falcons, one thing you can say about them is that they have stood firm on that. The other thing that they're standing firm on, and I think we stand firm here on Atlanta Football Party, is on where this offense is going next season. And it might be because of the athleticism for one player, and maybe Zac Robinson agrees. We'll take that under further review. This episode of our Atlanta Football Party is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder where the money go between dining out, online, shopping, entertainment? It's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. Your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control of your finances. Monarch Money, isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When you start using Monarch, you realize just how much you do spend on food delivery. So it helps you to budget smarter, helps you to save more. And instead of juggling multiple apps, which is important to me because my goodness, if I have one more app to use, but you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code locked on NFL for half off your first year. Monarchmoney.com helps you take control of your finances. So, Jarvis, as voluntary OTAs wrapped and the Falcons reset for mandatory minicamp, it kind of dawned on me that it's pretty cool that we're in the midst of the team having the good fortune of an entire offseason of onboarding Michael Penix Jr. So before we talk a little bit about what that might mean for Zac Robinson, before we talk about what that might mean actually for Michael Penix Jr. and his ability to develop relationships and chemistry and the like with his playmakers, let's talk about Zac Robinson. What do you see with the opportunity to have that 100% time frame with MPX versus maybe a smaller sample size when he's the backup QB? How does that help Zac Robinson in terms of new wrinkles, but not just new wrinkles, maybe new wrinkles that take into account his leg strength to complement his arm strength, something that Zac Robinson alluded to in a podcast recently?
I think when you think about the next level for this offense, I've always talked about a level of comfort. Like, how comfortable can Michael Penix be in this offense? What's going to help him the most, outside of knowing all the checks and knowing all the protections and making sure that that's all situated as he's coming to the line of scrimmage? It's the ease of being able to turn around and hand that ball off to 7 and 25. And I think that when you look at it from that aspect of it, there are so many things you can do that play off of that. Like, right, then you can use his legs to maybe have a play action rollout type situation, which we never was going to see last year, right? And people were understanding, like, why aren't they using play action? Because that mofo could not move. He couldn't do that. He just couldn't do it. Kirk could do it. He wasn't in a situation where he was comfortable doing that. So as an offensive coordinator, understanding that, like, you're not going to put your player in a situation where he's not comfortable. So I feel like MPS is going to be comfortable in those situations. And I feel like that's the next level of making sure you establish yourself in the run game. Continue. And you have multiple guys that can do it too, right? And then you just play off of that and you build off of that as the season goes along. Because, the one thing about the second year quarterback, I know he didn't play that many games. And this is what I'm interested to take a look at it, as how people handle Jayden Daniels as well, because they got a full season of tape that you can look at and say, okay, here's how we're going to attack this guy. That's not necessarily the case for Michael Penix. Like, because Zac Robinson still, it's almost like he got an incomplete last year. Like, okay, so we saw what you did well last year, and here's what we can do this year, another element to this offense that we're going to be able to get you better. And I think that Zac is full on board for that, because he talked about how it was coming into his first season as the OC. He was like, hey, reaching out to folks, trying to see what's going on. Hey, what are your thoughts on this? And hey, what's going to be my style? What do I like? What does the quarterback that I'm dealing with like? And he was a veteran quarterback in Kirk Cousins. Like, okay, Kirk was kind of maybe give him more feedback. But now that you're dealing with a guy like MPX, you're like, okay, he can kind of have a little bit more control. And as MPS get more comfortable in the offense, he can say, hey, here's what I like. Here's what I don't like. I understand we're implementing this element of the game. Here's where I feel like we can really take it to the next level, Mike Penix, that is, for this offense to get where it needs to be. And I think that's the cool part of making that transition from the first year into your second year as a play call.
Yeah, and I think too, Aaron, it's a small sample size for Zac Robinson in terms of in-game experience, but it was also a small sample size for the offseason because, again, you're not installing things for QB2, Michael Penix Jr. as QB2 last year, but you're installing things to take into consideration what he brings to the table that maybe you didn't have the ability to work with Kirk Cousins as your starter. But now that you do know, now that Zac knows he's got MPX as his starter, yes, he's got the arm strength. We all know that. But now we're talking about using a little bit of a leg strength and kind of looking at wrinkles that you can, or chances that you can take, some risks that you can take because you know you have a little bit more to work with than what he brings to the table.
Yeah, I mean, that was a question I think a lot of people had last year where, due to the limitations of Kirk Cousins, traditionally Kirk has played more under center and the Falcons were much more of a pistol offense last year. And it led to a lot of people speculating on whether or not the sort of true offense that Zac Robinson wanted to run was really designed for a quarterback like Michael Penix Jr. And sort of the expectation, in those final 3 games where like now we're going to finally see what this offense is supposed to look like. And you got flashes of that in those last 3 games when this offense was cooking, particularly against the Giants and the Panthers and, in some of those clutch moments against the Commanders. And sort of you're kind of wondering, are we going to get an expansion of that? Is that going to be rather than just sort of flashes that we're seeing from what this offense can look like with Michael Penix on the move on some of these rollouts, varying up some of these run concepts and whatnot? Are we going to get more of that? And so I think that sort of speaks to what Zac Robinson is saying. And so that to me is kind of the big question is like, are we going to get, the same offense that we saw, whether that's the Kirk Cousins offense or the Michael Penix offense, which are just kind of slight variations of one another, or are we going to get sort of a brand new offense that Zac Robinson has been cooking up in the lab for, the last 6 months or so, now that he has his quote unquote guy in Michael Penix, where, I think a lot of us look at sort of the potential and the ceiling of this offense, potentially being higher if things are sort of clicking for Michael Penix. And so that to me is kind of the big question. And we'll ultimately, we won't really get to see much of it in August, but, ultimately when we get to that first game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and sort of seeing what exactly they're going to be able to unveil and how much is Michael Penix's mobility going to be a featured part of this offense.
Yeah. And Tori, I'll go back to an article, one of your more recent articles on AtlantaFalcons.com, where you had a quote from Zac Robinson. It said, with Mike now, it opens up a different avenue.
Think that's very fair. To when you think about the situation with Chris Lindstrom, I think that Chris has been a very interesting case ever since he came into the league, right? Because I'll go back to my first time when I got a chance to get my eyes on Chris Lindstrom, and it was in one of those rookie mini camps mandatory mini camps, and they were doing 11-on-11, and I think that was one of the things where I looked at it and I said, okay, let me get my eyes on this guy, because obviously coming out of Boston College wasn't too much fanfare or too much hype coming out about Chris Lindstrom at that time. It was one situation where he was going against Rashid Hageman, and Rashid was, kind of Rashid Hageman. Like there'll be moments where he'll kind of flash, and you're like, oh, okay, you kind of understand why the Falcons drafted him, but he still was kind of young in his development to come what he was, which was essentially a second round bust. But you could definitely tell there was definitely talent there. So for me, I looked at that situation and said, okay, those guys got an opportunity to go up against each other. And when the ball was snapped, Rashid Hageman did a quick swim move right off the line. Boom, beat him. Got down to the quarterback, and I was like, oh, okay, Rashid, let's, giving the first round guard a little bit of a dose of his own medicine, right? So I'm like, okay, let me see what Chris Lindstrom going to do on the next play. Next play come around. Rashid Hageman, being the type of guy that he is, he tried to do it again. And next thing you know, that's all I saw. Chris Lindstrom just got his little feet set, got his head out of there, extended those arms, and gave him a quick punch, and Rashid Hageman was flying out of the doggone picture almost. So when I think about that, him showing that early on, it just makes me think about how he's just been able to develop from that level. Because I thought that having that type of recovery as a rookie, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine where this cat is going to be in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years. And when you think back to then, you're like, okay, you understand. I understand that, PFF is looking at Chris Lindstrom as one of those guys or one of those dudes. But when you think about what that is and what comes with that, and him being able to establish himself and continue to establish himself, continuing to develop in the type of player that he has become. I think that the Falcons, they got themselves a guy. They just got a guy at that right guard spot. And when you're talking with Chris, like, you understand that the way he plays, when you talk and engage with him, you just wouldn't expect him to be the type of player that he is on the field, because this dude is nasty. Like Aaron mentioned earlier, when you talk about a guy that's willing to cut you on a regular basis, oh my gosh, as a former defensive lineman, that just don't take too kindly to stuff like that. So for him to have that type of meanness, that type of nastiness, that willingness to just do whatever to get in front of the defender and his running back, to be able to cut off of him and break that bad boy for 30 or 40 yards. Yeah, like those are the type of guys that you want on your squad. And to Tori's point, like the development of their relationship between Caleb McGarry and Chris, that helps a lot too, because when you have your side mate, essentially, those guys got to be in sync. It's almost like they're doing a dance together. They got to be taking that right step at the same time. And then when they're going left, they got to be taking that same type of 45-degree angle step to the left. Those guys got to move in sync. And they has to have that communication that, okay, all right, Caleb, I see we're going left. You got this defensive tackle that was in that 3 technique. You kind of got your hands on them. So let me go ahead and move up so I can get this linebacker, like Aaron talked about, on the other side of the hash, right? So those are the reasons why he's able to get up to the next level, because of the communication, the continuity that Caleb has, that he and Caleb have. Those are some of the things that you have to look at and say, okay, this is where we are. This is what we're going to be able to do. And I think that is a skill set that not a lot of guards have, because he was the perfect fit for this particular system. So I think those are one of the reasons why you're going to look at Chris Lindstrom and you're like, man, I didn't really know who this cat was when they drafted him out of Boston College, but oh my gosh, I'm so glad they did, because he's the type of guy that can be a lifer for a particular program. He's the type of guy that the Falcons can give another contract when this one runs out, and be okay with him being one of the highest paid guards in the league. And I think that Chris Lindstrom has continued to prove that. He's continued to be that guy that, hey, this is who we are. This is what we know we have in this offense. And for me, I think this is something that we got to continue to hope that, he just stays healthy, because that's the only thing that's going to be holding him back from getting to where it's be. And one more thing before we move on and get ready to wrap this bad boy up, I think that, Chris said something I thought was very interesting last week in media availability out at voluntary OTAs. He said that he wants to be the greatest offense in the league. Like, he wants to be. That's the goal, to be that person, to be that guy, to be that offense, to lead the league, to be one of those high scoring offenses that we hope this team can be. And I think that when you have an internal goal of that and being willing to share those type of things, that's how they are doing the necessary things to be that offense. And I think that that's something that they are going to be. Before we get out of here, I want to talk about Mina Kimes. She's been showing the Falcons some love, talking about having the best fan base, which I wholeheartedly agree. There's no fan base like the Falcons fan base, because guess what? We know how to get down. We know how to celebrate. We know how to party, on Sundays at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. So, yeah, I agree with Mina. I appreciate you, Mina, for shouting us out. But she said something I thought was also pretty interesting. They had to pick an X factor for each team in the league. And when it came down to the Atlanta Falcons, they decided to say Jalon Walker is the X factor for this team. And I think that that's going to be really huge. And I think it might be a little bit pressure. Oh, yeah. I think that I can say that it will definitely be some pressure there. But I feel like Jalon Walker coming from where he came from, in that Georgia, that we get national championship or buzz type situation, like pressure doesn't really mean anything to a guy like Jalon Walker. And I think that when you think about what an X factor means, the definition for me is a guy that does multiple things. And I think that Jalon Walker is the definition of multiple things. I was looking at the draft video that the Falcons, draft series video that the Falcons put out, and they were kind of going through the process of how everybody got drafted, the phone calls and everything. And they came across this clip when they were interviewing Jalon Walker at the combine. And I was just like, oh my gosh. They asked him, I think it was Jock, the outside linebacker coach, Jock. He asked him, how would you define yourself, or what position do you play? He said, defense. I love that. I absolutely love that, because here's the thing. He wants to be a difference maker, meaning a lot of times when you put guys in one set position, offenses tend to watch tape and say, okay, he likes to line up on this side. He likes to line up on the right side of the offense, on the left side of the defense. So basically he's going to be facing our right tackle 85 to 90% of the time. So you can game plan for that. If you know where a guy like a Jalon Walker or a guy like a Michael Parsons, who he's been compared to, if you know where those guys are pre-snap, you can then game plan for those guys. However, when you talk about X factor, when you talk about a guy being able to do multiple things, that's where you can use it to your advantage. And I think that Jalon Walker being able to rush off the edge, absolutely that brings value. And then being able to play inside, right, on the second level, I think he's going to be used there. Raheem Morris even said it himself. I'm telling you guys, don't be surprised, because here's my nickel package. I already got it in my head. James Pierce Jr. on one side. I got Leonard Floyd on the other side. On FK, you got to put in a little work, bro. Get into my nickel. And then I got David Onyemata and Ruka Rororo down there on the inside. And I got Caden Ellis at the inside linebacker spot. Jalon Walker on the other inside linebacker spot. And they got like a little show blitz right up in the line of scrimmage. You don't know who coming. Oh my gosh. I can't wait to see it. And I think that when you have the ability to be able to take a guy who's working primarily off edge, that's what he says it's going to be primarily in his rookie year, and then you take him to go back and to that next level at the linebacker spot and say, hey, here's where we're going to use you here. And you got a team on third and long, and it's like, okay, we haven't seen this on tape yet. Okay, what are they going to do out of that? Is it a show he's going to come, or is it a show and he's going to get out of there and Caden Ellis is going to come? Guess what, guys? I would love to see Caden Ellis come, because guess what? That's him coming downhill and rushing the passer. That's what he does best. That's his best asset. So to have that type of lineup out there and be able to have the flexibility to move him from an edge spot to a linebacker spot and shoot maybe even a little bit of big nickel too, be able to get his hands on a tight end that might be giving him trouble. There is so many variations, so many things that the Falcons can do, Jeff Ulbrich that is, when it comes to how to deploy a guy like Jalon Walker. I absolutely agree wholeheartedly. When you're talking about what guy can be a nemesis for the opposing quarterback in their first year, and you can call him that guy that can be your X factor, yeah, Jalon Walker is definitely that guy for me as well. So I wholeheartedly agree with Mina Kimes, who've been showing a lot of love to this Falcons fan base and showing a lot of love to the city as well. I thank you guys for showing this football party some love and making it your first listen today. Why don't you check out my main man, Aaron Freeman, and make him your second listen today on Locked On Falcons. I'll show my pretty face, my pretty bug on there too. So y'all make sure y'all check that out on Fridays, as we end your week. Also, make sure you check out Tori McElhaney of AtlantaFalcons.com. She already dropping that good work over there. So you make sure to check it out as well. And Tanisha Batiste holding it down as the face of Locked On Sports Atlanta. We appreciate you guys, and we will see you guys on Thursday. We're reacting to the mandatory minis. Is Kirk going to be there or not? We'll talk about it, and we'll discuss all of that on Thursday on the Atlanta Football Party, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day.